Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're in Park City, Utah at the Sundance Film Festival, where a new film just premiered called Private Violence. It airs on HBO later this year. I sat down Tuesday with the film's director, Cynthia Hill, and its main subject, domestic violence survivor, advocate Kit Gruelle. We'll return to that interview in a moment, but first, this is a clip from the film where Kit seeks advice from a prosecutor about the case of a woman named Deanna Walters.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I want to talk with you a little bit about this case in Ashe County involving a woman who was kidnapped. Pretty severe beating.
And when you say kidnapped, do you mean?
Kidnapped.
Okay, held against her will.
Held against her will. She and her daughter. Taken out of the state and driven all the way to California and halfway back, and the truck was stopped in Oklahoma. This was in an 18-wheeler. Okay. And he beat her for 4.5 days.
What kind of injuries did she have? Holy crap.
So this is the injuries.
What did he use?
His fist, a Maglite flashlight. He bit her.
Any internal injuries? Or is it all tissue injury? Soft tissue injury?
Well, he also strangled her.
Okay. Do we have any medical doctor who's going to say these are serious injuries? Because, you know, in state court, that's the tough part, is when we're talking about soft tissue injuries, when you don't have damage to the spleen, internal injuries, or cuts that require stitches. Concussions can be serious injury.
The local prosecutor called this a misdemeanor assault.
Okay, no.
Yes.
Okay, no. I would push felony charges probably for kidnapping. If it's a Maglite's a deadly weapon. Assault with a deadly weapon, inflicting serious injury. It's all about getting a medical doctor to say on the stand, yes, this is serious injury. Is it serious bodily injury? Sure. Is it protracted pain and suffering that she has suffered? Yeah, I think so. But even if we succeed on all levels, what I'm telling you, Kit, is that you may not be satisfied with the amount of time that they're going to get at the state level.
If he was convicted only of misdemeanor assault on a female, even with doing this,
yeah,
what would he be looking at as far as time?
The most he could receive is 150 days in jail.
150 days in jail for this?
That's it. So that's what I'm saying. You have a clear case where he's transporting a woman across state lines for the purpose of terrorizing and assaulting her. That is a federal case all over. And so what we need to do, or what you need to do, since it's not, you know, in my county, is really push and talk to the federal prosecutor in that area, in that district, which would be the Western District, and say, this is a case, and get them interested in it. I think they will be. Mm-hmm. I think they will be.
Yeah.
So that's a clip from the film Private Violence. Astounding conversation you have with the prosecutor. Can you tell us who Deanna Walters is, who her abuser was, what happened?
Deanna Walters is a woman from the mountains of North Carolina, from West Jefferson. She was attempting to separate from her husband, and he wound up kidnapping her and their daughter and putting them in an 18-wheeler. He had his cousin drive. And as they left North Carolina and drove all the way out to California and halfway back to Oklahoma, Robbie beat Deanna and strangled Deanna and kicked Deanna and urinated in her face and beat her with a Maglite flashlight and almost killed her. And she survived. When the truck was stopped in Oklahoma, she was taken to the local hospital.
And it was stopped because, explain how the police were alerted.
It was only stopped because Robbie put Deanna on the phone with people that he was paranoid that she was having affairs with, which was baloney. She wasn't, she wasn't doing that at all. And because of her robotic sort of approach to having these conversations, they became concerned that something was happening. They called the trucking company. The trucking company realized that he had unauthorized riders in the cab, and the truck was pulled over in Oklahoma, and Deanna got out of the cab looking like this, just like she'd been in the worst car accident possible. I mean, her face was smashed in. She had petechial hemorrhage in her eyes, which is the first symptom of acute strangulation assaults. Her body was bruised from the top of her head to the tip of her toes. Her knees were grotesquely swollen, where he'd beaten her with a Maglite flashlight, I think, so that she couldn't run. And
her daughter watched.
Her daughter witnessed everything.
Her daughter was how old?
Deanna was 3 or 4 at the time, and she witnessed everything.
Her daughter?
Yeah, Martina. And Martina was just screaming and screaming over and over again, "Why are you doing this to my mom? Why are you doing this to my mom?" And Robbie would say things to Martina like, "I'm doing this because your mother doesn't love us, so it's okay for me to do this." And Deanna had had a seizure disorder that had been in check, but after the blows to the head, her seizure disorder has now started back up again, so she's on medication for that. And yet when she got back to North Carolina, the local prosecutor, his first question to her was, "Why didn't you try to run?" And you know, there are 1,000 reasons why she didn't try to run. Robbie said that if she tried to run, he'd kill Martina. She didn't know where she was. She was hideously beaten. She was being threatened with her life. She was afraid that if she ran or tried to run, he'd kill her, and she didn't know what would happen to Martina. So this is why we have to stop asking women, "Why don't you just leave?"
And there was another problem. The question of where she was beaten would determine whether he was charged and where he would be charged,
right,
given that he was crossing state lines.
Right, right. Well, he kidnapped her in North Carolina, but the local prosecutor seemed unimpressed with her injuries. In fact, when Robbie did come back from Oklahoma, he told the local law enforcement officers that he beat her so bad that he thought he broke his fingers, and yet they still only charged him with misdemeanor assault on a female.
They left him on the roadside, the police,
right,
because he had her say that he was saving her from a beating by someone else, and that's why she was in the truck.
And he also told her not to say that he'd done this. So as long as Robbie was within earshot, of course she was going to say what she'd been instructed to say, but the minute she was able to say, "No, he did this to me," by then he was gone, hitchhiking back to North Carolina.
So, Cynthia Hill, as you follow the story as a filmmaker, as it unfolds, and you were doing it as it unfolds.
Yes.
So you didn't know the final outcome?
No. When we first met Deanna, it was just a few months after the incident had actually happened, and she was so distraught, thinking that nothing was going to come of this and that he was not going to be held accountable for anything. And she just was, I don't know, she just, and you can see this in the film, she just is, she seems hopeless, like, I don't know what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to have to live with this. But what's amazing about having this story and this trajectory and watching this process of seeking justice and the feds finally picking up the case and him actually going to prison for almost 21 years and seeing Deanna transform from victim to survivor is pretty spectacular. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, it's one of the things I have never seen in a film or a documentary film, actually being able to see physically her transformation.
The horrific injuries she suffered, the police that found her said they hadn't seen injuries like that even in car accidents when they dragged people out from head to toe.
Yeah, there's this one image of her laying on the hospital bed and she looks like a corpse. It looks like she's dead. She just is so bruised, and you just cannot imagine somebody actually experiencing all of this in the way she looks and still be alive.
But unlike in many cases, he is convicted. He is sentenced. Talk about that.
Yeah,
sentence.
we were thrilled at the sentence that he got, because it shows the difference between the federal prosecution, where he got a 21-year plus sentence, and in North Carolina, the most he would have gotten is 150 days. So it just shows the stark contrast.
And it was 150 days he would have gotten, because that's 150 days is 30 times 4, 30 times 5 is 5 months.
For beating her like he did.
Almost to death. This is attempted murder.
It should have been charged as attempted murder, right. But because of the kind of inherent patriarchy in our criminal justice system, and because there are many laws that still regard women as less than or as the property of their husbands, because that's the reality of how it plays out. I mean, we do have good laws on the books in some states, but how do those laws get translated? And what does it mean for someone like Deanna to be beaten that badly by her husband, and then to have the person who's in charge of holding him accountable for what he did look at her and say, why didn't you run? It's just a completely upside down and backwards way to approach this very private violence that ultimately plays itself out in public ways. Because when kids grow up exposed to domestic violence, they tend to not do well in school. Oftentimes they wind up running away, girls get pregnant early, boys become violent themselves, they join gangs. So I refer to domestic violence as kind of the petri dish for all the other social issues that we ultimately pay for.
Having worked in a domestic violence shelter, battered women's shelter myself, I know another issue is dealing with the police, and that's dealt with very well in this film. You actually train police in how not to abet the abuser. What is the accepted wisdom now on what to do when a cop is called into a domestic violence situation, which is probably the most violent situation overall? Domestic violence cases are the most violent and threatening for police officers of any situation, which most people might not know.
Well, one of the things that has happened thanks to the Violence Against Women Act is that there has been a lot of law enforcement training, and part of what they look at now is who's the dominant aggressor. And so they've been trained in looking at offensive versus defensive injuries. They do a much more comprehensive and thorough job gathering evidence, talking to other people, talking to neighbors, and as a result, I think that a majority of law enforcement officers around the country now see domestic violence as an actual crime, and they treat it like a crime. But unfortunately, in many pockets around the country, it's still not considered criminal conduct. And so for me, as someone who works very closely with law enforcement in North Carolina and also in California, I just hope that in the next months, years, decades, that we can really start to focus on this crime and deal more appropriately early on with the offender rather than blaming her for what he's done.
In California, you train hostage negotiators because of your experience with women as hostages in domestic violence situations? Well,
part of what we're trying to get the negotiators to understand is that battered women are what we refer to as benign hostages. And what we mean by that is that they wake up every morning and their abuser gives them a set of rules and regulations that they have to live by. And if they don't abide by those terms and conditions strictly, then there are consequences, physical violence, sexual violence, coercion, intimidation. And 80% of the hostage-taking incidents every year in this country are domestic violence related. Most people think it's about banks, but it's not. It's almost always where, the woman has done what everyone has told her to do. She's left, she's gotten an order of protection, she's drawn a line in the sand, and yet he says to her and to the court system and everyone else, you're not walking away from me. And he goes over and barricades in, and then the hostage negotiators are called out.
In fact, there aren't many mass shootings,
yes,
when you actually read the article or listen carefully to the story, have to do with a man going after a woman in some situation, or her family or friends or the children.
In fact, it just happened here in Utah last week. Right as we got here, there was a police officer who shot and killed his wife, his 2 children, his mother-in-law, and then himself. And what I've heard from the domestic violence community around here, she had separated from him, and then they reconciled at the holidays. But it sounds like she probably had decided that it wasn't going to work and was about to leave. And for many battered women, that's the most dangerous time for them.
Cynthia, what are you hoping to do with this film? It is not an easy film, and so it probably had something to do with you making your decision about whether, I mean, on the one hand, it's such an important subject, but how are you going to get support for it, get audiences for it?
Well, just a step back, I think what we really want to happen with the film, or what we want audience to walk away with is to not ask that question anymore of why doesn't she just leave, because it's clear after watching this film that you cannot ask that question and expect to get any results that are meaningful. I mean, all it does is just blame the victim for the whole situation without putting any sort of responsibility on the perpetrator at all. And then also as a society, we need to understand that we do play a role in this.
You have an astounding moment in the film where a woman has killed her abuser, and the comment that these women who are so violated actually feel safer in prison than they do so-called free.
Every woman that I've ever worked with who's killed her abuser, when she goes into the prison system, she says, "I've never felt this safe." And it just blows my mind that this is, this is the United States of America. And for battered women who turn to the criminal justice system, like Deanna did, only to be told, your injuries don't satisfy me as being serious enough to do anything with it. And then it continues to happen, or she decides, I'm not going to call 911 because what's the point? And then she has to take matters into her own hands. And then she goes to prison and says, well, this is the safest I've ever felt.
Finally, Kit, you've done this work for decades now. What gives you hope? Do you see improvement in how domestic violence is dealt with?
Well, I mean, it's a privilege to be a part of this opportunity to train law enforcement officers in North Carolina and in California. I have to say California is very forward-thinking about this crime, so that gives me hope. We still have a long ways to go, and it's not exclusive to the criminal justice community. I think that everyone has to understand that when they look away from a battered woman, all they're doing is reinforcing the isolation. So if what anyone and everyone can do when they see or hear something that gives them an indication that a woman's being abused, that rather than looking away, if they can learn a few basic things, helping her understand that this is not her fault, that there's help for her, that she's not alone, that we understand that leaving an abuser is not an event, it's a process, but there are people in the community who can help you do this, is so important to helping her understand that she does in fact have people she can turn to. But then the other side of it is we have to say to abusers, you can't do this anymore.
Kit Gruelle is an advocate for survivors of domestic violence, and Cynthia Hill, director of the new HBO documentary, Private Violence, which is currently at the Sundance Film Festival and will air on HBO later this year. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, Alive Inside, a story of music and memory. Stay with us.